was a brilliant one, as usual, from our own Leila Johnson Salami. Another great leap for mankind, one dare say, hitting the 8 billion mark. And as you may have heard, it was just 11 years ago that humanity celebrated the 7th billionth landmark. Closer home here in Nigeria, sobering numbers within the week from the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics. 133 million Nigerians now survive on less than $1 a day. A few years ago, that figure was hovering around 90 million. Well, to make a sense of it all, we are now being joined by Dr. Sam Amadi, a lawyer, development consultant, and director at Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. Dr. Amadi is also a former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Good morning, Dr. Amadi.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning indeed. Thanks for joining us. Well, I mean, a bit to unpack there. Humanity has hit the 8 billion mark in terms of population. And Nigeria, as a result, is now, the 6th most populated country. But the bad news, shall we say, is the fact that 64% of Nigerians, according to the new report from National Bureau of Statistics and UNDP, is that 133 million Nigerians out of the 216 that were estimated to be are poor people. How do we deal with this reality? Huge population, 6th in the world, but then the highest number of poor people in the world. How do you unpack this for us,
well,
really?
I think...
yes, go on, please.
I think it's a classic case of double whammy because if you look at the UN report on this growth, you discover that much of it will be young people, especially in Nigeria, where the youth population is high. And what that means that you require investment in education, social facilities, and jobs for the young people, not just to avoid overpopulation as we have, but of course, ensure that as more people become educated and enter the middle class and prosperity zone, chances are that you see drop in birth rate, growth in birth rate, because essentially a much more economically empowered, educated, middle-class citizens, all is being equal, minus religious values, you normally drop. That's why probably India will overtake China, because the China one-child policy and urbanization and economic growth and living poverty meant that people will have fewer children, essentially. So, but if you have many of our citizens very poor, multidimensional poverty, as the NBS report shows, then it is not just the fact of a diminutive livelihood, poverty, and all that goes into crime and everything, but also the fact that you might be having that prophecy fulfilled, which is Nigeria becoming maybe in some years down the line the third and maybe one of these days the fastest growing birth rate in the world. Okay, now if you look at the multidonor report index survey that we have now, it tells multiple stories. The first is that we know that ordinary income-based assessment of poverty, Nigeria is a very poor country. But if you look at the multidimensional poverty index, Nigeria is actually very, very poor. This time around, the NBS wisely added the fourth factor, which is work, jobs, and shock. Now, unemployment is going high. Nigerians have little protection from vulnerability. The vulnerability index is very high because unlike some other poor African countries, Cameroon, our neighbors and all that, they have a better protection. If we look at maternity protection, prenatal and post, various protections than we have. So the fact, apart from the income poverty, which is high, the multidimensional poverty, which means that Nigerians are more vulnerable, Nigerians are more exposed to risk, Nigerians have worse livelihood, not just the poverty, the financial poverty as we look at it. Now, the implication of this actually, of growing poverty for individuals, is also that livelihood falls drastically We might see a spike in crime rates, as we are seeing now. What the economists call the marginal propensity to invest will be lower and lower as people struggle to meet the basics. They will not save, they will not invest, and they will under-consume critical drivers of development, health and education. They will under-consume because basically they are living at below basics. So all this piled together. And then if you marry this to the World Bank report, interesting, the World Bank report, which came out a couple of days, talked about increase in our poverty rate to 95 million plus 1 million people. And the argument there is that 5 more million people fall into poverty in 2022 alone. And again, the big story, the effort of the federal government to take people out of poverty has nil effect. So all the traders' money, the 5,000 naira dispensed to market women and everything, had nil effect. The World Bank says if you control for the COVID that added extra 5.1 million people to the poverty rate, Nigeria's poverty spiked by population growth will still remain what it was in 2020. That means all the interventions did not bring down poverty. And that should be a message to those who are campaigning for the office now, that you need to do more to remove people from poverty. We're going to remove 10 million people from poverty. And the World Bank report shows that it had nil effect. Why? Because we are doing poverty reduction as an add-on. We are not mainstreaming like China and other countries, like India, for example, that lowered 50% poverty to 25% poverty rate in a time of space of 10 years, or 10 to 50 years, through doubling their GDP. So we need to grow the economy at a very fast rate, number one. We need to revise our social laws, our labor relations law, particularly, to ensure more protection so that as the economy grows double digit, maybe, it won't be like the roaring 20s, under President Obasanjo, we had significant 7%, 6% for over about 10 years or more growth, but we didn't have the consequential improvement in poverty rate because the policies that distribute that growth fairly, the areas of the growth where the growth is happening, happening in areas where more people are employed, where income increases, salaries are increased, where social benefits go to more people. If we don't do a lot of this, we will see that in the next 10 years, not just that we'll be very poor, excessively poor, but we're going to be a country that's also difficult to get back to development because of excessive insecurity, very poor consumption pattern, and very negative propensity to save and invest, in which case the economy might actually collapse. So it's actually more important to focus now on driving down the poverty rate through this both growth-based and equity-based approaches, because not just for today, but actually the future is going to look much more dismal with expected increase in population, with expected social crisis in terms of urbanization. Look at the traffic situation everywhere growing, with depleting natural resources, oil wasting, and the transition to innovation economy not happening, and expansion in manufacturing base not happening because you don't even have enough capital formation to spike that industrial takeoff. So this is going to be a double whammy or multiple, perfect storm for us, because we're not growing the economy, we are diminishing the human capital, we are increasing insecurity and social unrest, and at the same time, we are wasting natural resources. Per capita, we just can't have enough natural resources, enough even geographical space to have decent life. So I think that should be a major focus on development now, in order to grow the economy fast enough and use equitable policies to get people, so many people out of poverty, so that they too can become productive and expand our income as well as social facilities that will help to cope, and then of course drive down population growth As people get richer, more urbanized, more educated, more mainstream into the good life, they will likely have lower birth rate, and that will compound in half a decade or so to very lower growth rate, and then we might be better off than what the future looks like.
All right, Dr. Amadi, well said. Well, now, 133 million Nigerians, that pretty much represents about 63% of the country's population. But let's take a little step back and approach this all from a definitional point. When we talk of multidimensional poverty, what exactly do we refer to here? What characterizes the state? At what point does a Nigerian say, I am poor, I fall under this bracket? Let's understand what exactly it means to be poor.
Okay, exactly. In the income-based assessment, you're looking at what people are earning, and then the NBS looks at therefore what they can afford. Benchmark maybe what should an average person buy as daily intake of food, and then you use their income to say, okay, these persons are poor because they earn. This is all their income, including formal and informal. Now, when you look at more dimensional, you're looking at first, for example, you look at education, access to education, quality of education, the level of education people have. You are looking at healthcare. What kind of healthcare? That's why, for example, a state like Bayelsa that does extremely well, does well, on the top when it comes to income-based poverty. Bayelsa, I think, used to be the least poor in the country because it has lower population with a lot of cash flow. So per capita, it's a rich state. But now when you look at access to healthcare, education, you look at livelihood of the people, you look at employment, work, and shock, vulnerability assessment. Basically, it looks at the dimensions of which human development can be assessed. Education, health, access to water, sanitation, power, energy, all these are factored in. They are the variables that constitute basic four factors. Usually they used to look at health, they look at education, they look at livelihood. Now, they have added a fourth factor, which is work, job, and shock. What kind of shock are people going through? So if you look at it now, Bayelsa now falls in the top 5 that are multidimensionally poor. Whereas in the income assessment alone, it doesn't fall in that group. So what it's telling you is that when we look at the income, it can hide a lot of vulnerability and poverty as a state of livelihood, as well-being, not just in terms of assets. So if you look at assets and you see that a few people have billions in a small population, that overcompensates. So that if you add all their stock, and then look at the population, then it's not a poor country, it's not a poor state. But when you now look at how they live their life every day, what access to basic services do they have, then you begin to see a dimension of poverty that is not captured by income. So what this multidimensional poverty index is basically saying, this is actually how people development as freedom, like Amadi and argue. This is actually how people live in this place. These people are poor because they don't have access to these basic things. They don't have good education. They don't have health care. They don't have food. They don't have sanitation. They have very poor, sanitation. All that adds to livelihood. They have lower employment and job, and they suffer from massive shock, no absorption for shocks like maybe the pandemic, maybe flooding. All these constitute shocks. So essentially, multidimensional poverty is actually a real index of people's vulnerability, people's living standard, and people's human development index to tell us more about who is left behind, who is struggling to access the basic functionalities of a human being, looking at it from the capability perspective. What are people able to do? What can they get to support a normal human life? And that's why both the UNDP and everybody else thinks that multidimensional poverty, especially in countries like ours where some money bubble can be cloud and conceal the level of deprivation that people suffer. It's actually a good index to assess what's happening to the rest of us, the left behind.
All right, Dr. Amadi, but my worry though is the reliability of data in all of this. When we speak about India being the poverty capital before Nigeria, what comes to mind is that, yes, it's because India has 1.3 billion people, and then just about 6% of their population, is considered to be poor. But then if we now use the multi-dimensional poverty index, on India or other parts of the, of the world, are we likely to get this sort of high rate that we got using the multidimensional poverty index for Nigeria, which moved it, from 33% that it was, if you're just using income poverty, to 63% now. And then let me also quickly, I'm sure you're aware, because of, according to the World Bank, let me read to you something that cropped up lately. According to the World Bank, the countries with the highest poverty rates in the world, and this is a 2022 World Bank thing, South Sudan at 82.30%, Equatorial Guinea at 76.80%, Madagascar at 70.70%. And you could have all those 10, countries there without Nigeria being there, maybe because we're at 63%. How reliable is this data? And then does that make Nigeria's situation, that scary, that it looks like, we're doing so badly, whereas others, may also be dealing with the same things that we're dealing with, especially in challenged countries?
Yeah, I think the data are credible. Now, if you look at the UNDP report on global multidimensional poverty index, India is actually the highest with 22%. Nigeria is about 9%. So clearly, India is still ahead of us in multidimensional poverty, even as some report the World Poverty Clock once put us as having the highest number of poor people in terms of number. But India is still topping that list. Again, countries like Nepal, it's also a function, the percentage will also reflect the population. So when you hear something like South Sudan being the poorest country from an income normal assessment, I think they are right, because in those countries, you're looking at the total population. So if you have a country of, let's say, 10 million people, and 6 million, 8 million falls into that category of extremely poor people, then that would be totally close to 80 to 90% of the population poor. So Madagascar, they are rightly placed where they are. And data collection has improved. MBC itself, if you look at the World Bank report, it validates, or rather aligns with MBC report. World Bank estimation of Nigeria at 95.1 million people poor from the normal poverty assessment. Continues with the same 42% of the 2022 and 2021 assessment of MBS, and simply says, look, what has increased it is the fact that you have growth rate. So you are growing, the population is growing at X rate, and then expectedly the number of people in poverty grows, except you create stronger growth factor. So in economic growth factor than birth rate factor. So if, for example, we know that this is the birth rate of Nigeria, means at every 5-10 years, this is the number we're going to have. And then we are taking more than that number out of poverty. It's difficult to take people out of poverty, as we know, even from our private, anecdotal assessment. If you look at the neighbors, people who have been poor for like 5-6 years in a classical sense, you discover that it's really difficult for them to exit poverty. Now, so when a country needs to exit poverty, it has to do very conscious, deliberate, and align its policies to address that deprivation. Look at the Oxfam report in 2021 or 2020, when they said Nigeria was one of the highest has the highest number of poor people in the world. Oxfam says 3 things are driving this. One is budgets. You need to sanitize and reform your budgeting process to focus on those sectors that have proven capacity to impact more on the poor. 2, it says you have very anti-people labor laws, relationships. I did some work for the US government on labor relations in Nigeria, and I discovered that, look, protection for workers, minimum wage, all these create deepen poverty. And thirdly is that there is an emerging neoliberal economics that we have bought into the free market model with the risk that we might create pockets of wealth in very large increasing ocean of poverty. And so they say, look, you have to look back at the model of development, whether you're going to fix free market or social market or government market model, because each of these have consequences for poverty. So I think this data is a credible data because they align with national government's own data. The key question he asks about whether Nigeria is worse off or better off is that Nigeria's role in history and place in Africa, it's much more dangerous for Nigeria to fall into extreme poverty than for Sudan or for Madagascar. Why? Because the population means that Nigeria could even threaten security stability in the region or the sub-region. Nigeria is so big to fail. Nigeria is so massive. And if you look at the population of Nigeria getting up to 450 million people, and then if you carry on this rate of poverty, it means that by the time you get to 450 million people, you might actually have 200 to 300 million of those people extremely poor, agitated, restless. So when they flood this continent, it's going to be a major human welfare disaster in Africa. So I would think that both for Nigerians and development partners, a Nigerian poverty rate growing is much more worrisome of concern than Sudan or Madagascar because of Nigeria's very important geopolitical positioning in Africa, in the world. And for us as Nigerians, it matters because if you map increasing poverty to our other social crisis index, whether in terms of religious fundamentalism, in terms of state illegitimacy, people questioning the Nigerian state, and insurgents and rebels arraying themselves, whether in terms of escalating banditry and lawlessness in this territory, it means that you're going to have more of this and less of it, because poverty itself is a factor that drives both agitation, extremism, agitation, and all forms of social conflict. So I will be worried. I will be worried that Nigeria is keeping this company. And I think the data is credible with margins of error here and there. But essentially, we should work with this data and they tell terrible stories about our present and our future. I'm more concerned about the future because what we see is that the trend, when the dangerous indicators are happening like this, when in the future they compound and then they coagulate and then create a much more difficult and complex and difficult to resolve situation. So don't see them as today. See the trending, the movement, and see how they all converge into a very, very difficult situation to resolve through public policy, and weakens the state capacity to formulate and implement these policies that can transform this circumstance. So this is the right time to come together and deal heavy blow on the growing poverty, because otherwise it has the effect of even weakening the capacity of the state to solve the problems down the line.
All right, Dr. Amadi, we're still talking about this data. Let's tarry on that a little bit. Now, this data itself highlights that multidimensional poverty in the country is highest in Sokoto. We also have Bayelsa, we have Jigawa, Kebbi, Gombe, and Yobe. While on the other hand, this is where it gets interesting, Ondo State is recorded as the lowest. What would you say is responsible for this disparity or dichotomy or in buoyancy levels?
I think it's both environmental and social. So yeah, that's the point I was making about Bayelsa keeping an odd company there, because in other assessments of poverty, Bayelsa is not always at the top because of, like I said, the disproportionate impact of money, cash availability among a few people in a small population. So it gives you a distorted view of well-being. Now, I think that if you look at Ondo, for example, well, it's in the southwest of Nigeria, one of the educated, if you like, where quality of life is actually higher. Now, I look at things like, for example, access to healthcare. You might look at this, it might not be that they have very great third-tier tertiary health institutions. It might be basic access. It's better in those places. It also has to do with access to education and quality of education. We talked about other things like water, other things like sanitation, food availability. And then you look at also the fact that, so at the end of the day, the question is how many people in this state are deprived in these major ways, and how many people in this state have more than basics of this. So, and the difference between these states might be small. If you look at those 5 who are the worst, they are not indistinguishable from each other. So on the topping does not mean that it's an outlier. It doesn't mean that it's out there far different from the other. It means that maybe it has an age. And until we look at the raw data and then do kind of map it to experience of people who live in those areas, we might not be able to know why Ondo did better than Imo, for example, or did better than Lagos. I can understand why it should do better than Lagos. Lagos has a lot of slums and it's like 2 cities, the rich and the poor. And so if you look at the poor and their deprivations, not the small screen, not the beautiful houses, not the streets paved with painted and lights, no, but deprivation, then Lagos might not even come on that top. So if you look at the data, raw data, and then we'll look at experience of people who live, and we'll see that if you take one, for example, so let's say health, access to health, you might see that truly this small state or this not very prominent state in terms of other things may have lower deprivation in access to that particular service. So when we put everything together, you see, I've seen when I did the MBS previous reports, and I look at them carefully and I map it to anecdotes, experience, they come out credible. I have no doubt that this will be the same. But I was surprised when I saw Ondo in typical poverty assessment. I will see things like, but of course, Bayelsa is always there, Anambra, a few of those states will be there. And of course, the outliers, the top bottom will be states like Sokoto and all that and all that. But Bayelsa and Ondo, stick out as outliers. But if you look at the concept we are dealing with here, you understand why maybe. Yes, Bayelsa, I can understand why. I have the experience in Bayelsa. I see the level of deprivation. I see the level of rural poverty. I see the lack of access to basic things covered up by hot money. Bayelsa is one of the per capita financial bank overbanked. You see several banks in Yenagoa, many banks, because that's money to collect and save. But you step out of Yenagoa, you see nothing. You see people who are struggling with environmental devastation, and that lowers their life function and capability. So essentially, I think it's a credible report. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so very much, Dr. Sam Amadi. Always a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for shedding some more light on this.